Cooperative Automated Transportation. We didn't have time for questions, but if we do have a few questions for the Secretary, we'll go ahead and entertain those now. Any questions for the Secretary? I know people are just getting back. I'll ask again, are there any questions for the Secretary of Transportation on his presentation on national developments in cooperative automated transportation?
I just did an amazing job presenting, Jim. That's what it was. And so
That's what it was, Roger. I'm sure of it.
I'm sure it was. And people also know where to find me. So I'm sure if anybody has any questions, give me a shout.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our next item on the agenda, which is the AV and industry panel. We have industry representatives will share their insights and experience testing in other states, offer input into Washington State's current law on AVs, and provide an overview of their work, products, and future plans. The first one we have up is Cesar Diaz, Government Relations Senior Manager, Aurora. Cesar, you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Jim. And, good afternoon, everybody. And I'm definitely behind on the background Zoom game there. That both you and the Secretary had some really good background. So I'll have to keep practicing that. Let me go ahead and set this up for 1 sec. All right, cool. Technical difficulties. There you go. Well, can everybody hear me now?
Okay. Yes, sir, we can.
And the Aurora presentation is up, the backdrop?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, thank you again. I'll take it away. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, Washington. Really want to thank you all for the invitation. I want to thank Rima Markel for helping me prepare for this, and also to Sam from TechNet to originally making the introduction. So it is an honor to be with you this afternoon. I'm with Aurora. We're a self-driving technology company based in California, in Palo Alto, California. I'm literally here working out of garage, in the spirit of Silicon Valley or the spirit of COVID-19. What I look to do today with the presentation is just to tell you a little bit about Aurora. And then after doing so, I'll spend a little time on where we're testing and our experiences of how that's been across 3 different states. So I'll go ahead and kick it off. Still getting all my fun stuff. Okay. Well, what I like to start with is the mission of Aurora. Our mission is to deliver the benefits of self-driving technology safely, quickly, and broadly. And it's important that I mention how that kind of breaks into our ethos of how we work at Aurora. So by safely, as many probably other companies have mentioned before, the benefits of self-driving technology, we do believe that we can save some lives. Every year, just in the US, we have about over 36,000 deaths on the road, mainly contributed by human error. So, and that's the status quo. So we have to do something about that. And this is where the technology has a benefit to change that. I think what I like to say is that self-driving vehicles, what they do in removing human error is that, one, they don't fall asleep behind the wheel, they don't drink behind the wheel, and they don't make some of the same errors. So that's kind of what we're moving towards. We have quickly in there because accepting the status quo of that this lives are lost every year, this amount is just not acceptable. So it's a kind of very mission driven that we kind of work towards that goal of making sure that we perfect the technology and we get there. And broadly, so the benefits of this technology cannot just be for a certain class of folks, a certain region, a certain type of industry. It really should be for everybody. And I like to say that, we would be failing if we created a product that literally just delivers ice cream at someone's house when they want it to. That would be a failure for what we're trying to do in the spirit of this. So that is who Aurora is briefly on that. And let's see. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about where our safety kind of lies, and also in delivering the benefits, we can also expand access that about 6 million people have disabilities in the U.S. who have difficulty accessing the transportation needs. Right, the current needs their needs are not being met by what's out there at the moment. Right, and so I think this is where the future lies in terms of. There was even a panel, I think yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, the PAVE had regarding accessible design development and so forth. So, I mean, that is something that's at the center of having access and providing those benefits broadly. Again, we talk about improving people's lives and how much in whether you're in cities in Seattle, whether you're in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, and other parts that, you know, a lot of people have to commute and spend a lot of time, a lot of hours. And if you add that up, a lot of days of it, 10 days a year commuting. So we think with self-driving vehicles, that could be changed a little bit by the efficiency it would create, but also by shared rides and kind of moving people in that motion. And in terms of cities, right, where most of the vehicles and companies are, we're testing in cities. But one thing that you see would free up would essentially be all the space is taken up by parking, or not all of it, but, you know, you start seeing over time parking. Most of us spend majority of our time figuring out where to park our car. Our car stays parked now, if not days at a time or weeks at a time, but even previously it was staying probably most of the day your car was parked. So imagine no longer being tethered to paying for a parking spot or even a vehicle if you're able to access. So that's something that self-driving technology brings. Our experience. So the pictures you see before you, just take a minute to kind of, as you can see through them, basically are where our founders and other key staff or employees have worked at and their experiences in self-driving technology. I highlight the CAT vehicle there and that was part of the DARPA challenges that our CEO, Chris Urmson, was involved back early on when this industry was kicking off and trying, kind of really part of a challenge that the department, that the US put out there, right? And then you see different slogans from Uber to Zoox. And so different folks in our company have had these backgrounds and have worked at these different places and bring that shared knowledge and learnings to Aurora. And that's kind of what we are, I think, bring that specialty to us to then share with someone like me who's on government relations, but our engineers, our product managers, and so forth. As I mentioned, we are co-located, I would say, in Palo Alto, and then also co-located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And those are our two offices, but we also have an office in San Francisco. We have an office in Bozeman, Montana. Bozeman, Montana, we purchased a company over a year ago, a LiDAR company, and that's why we have an office out there and many people that are kind of part of the LiDAR aspect of our technology. And Dallas is a footprint that we just announced recently, in particular trucking that I'll go into a little bit later. But that is where Aurora has operations in up to this day. So the dawn of a new driver, what you'll see here in this, oops, jumped on me faster, that dawn. What you'll see on this image is at the top is one of our vehicles, the Chrysler Pacifica. That is one of the vehicles we are testing. And as well as down below, you see a couple of big rigs that are there in the picture. The delivery vehicle is something that we don't have, but I just want to show those are the two vehicles we're testing, the Chrysler Pacifica as well as the trucking. And those are kind of where we're focused at the moment. The Aurora ecosystem. So what is Aurora actually doing? So I think one of the things that, different companies are focused on different efforts. So we are building the Aurora Driver. What I like to say is Aurora Driver is the operating system, the brains that powers all the different operations in the vehicle. So it sits at the center, a combination of software, hardware, and data services. And by sitting at the center, it powers the logistical services that in terms of we'll be able to, so it's an independent platform that essentially will be able to work for passenger service, which you're seeing there with mobility services. We'll also be working in logistics, so mid-level, mid-mile delivery, fleet management, part of a fleet, and also other vehicles like down below where you're seeing big rigs. So our platform is able to use those different transportation systems. So we're not building just for passenger service. We're not building just for big rigs. We're not building for trucks. The Aurora Driver is something that can operate in all those different aspects and in terms of those networks. And again, a little bit more about it. What you have is this fully integrated self-driving stack that's at the middle core of hardware, where you have it sitting in the vehicles. You have the cloud, which allows you to upload and download the information. As many of you know in the space, that the information that you gather from our sensors, how they see the world is how a vehicle is able to get from point A to point B. And you really need to be able to have that up and down and exchange of data in order to be able to accomplish that successfully. And again, with the Aurora Driver being at the center, you're able to basically, work at different vehicle types. And that's what we like to say that's kind of unique about our experience. We also have we've worked with collaboratively with a couple different companies. One of those is Fiat Chrysler. Hyundai, Kia is another one, and Volkswagen. So those are some of the partnerships that we've worked with in the past and currently. And yeah, just want to share a little bit about it. So I think probably one of the focuses of today's presentation that maybe most of you are hoping that I'd get to right off the bat is not showing you where we're operating, but really showing you the experience that we've had in California, Pennsylvania, and Texas. So we're not testing, and what I mentioned that is, we are testing in California, we are testing in Pennsylvania, and we are testing in Texas. And that's a new one that we just started back in the last couple months. We are not testing in Bozeman, Montana, although that may be something we do in the future. But the experiences of what we've encountered in these different places, I think hopefully can guide what Washington is trying to do, which is, if we build it or if we regulate it, will you come here, right? That's what I've heard in different meetings and different conversations. Like, what do we need to do to attract the industry for it to be developed here in Washington, for it to come here and test, for it to stay away? What different conversations I've been in. So I'll start kind of anchoring it with California, and then a little bit Pennsylvania, and then just Texas since recently. So I think the thing to think about it is, similar to California legislation, similar to Washington, but California's legislation was passed in 2012. And it kicked off a series of rulemakings that started with the Department of Motor Vehicles. And the path that went forward was that not only was it the Department of Motor Vehicles, but as it kept moving forward, it got segmented a little bit more. So what the Department of Motor Vehicles did was basically split it off and saying, okay, we're going to create rulemaking for a driver service and a driverless, right? So you can do driver testing and driverless testing. You can have a vehicle operator behind the wheels, no one behind the wheel, right? And that was two different segments, rulemakings and permits you'd have to get to test. It actually then went to segment a little bit further and saying, we're going to segment the types of vehicles, the classes. So the first one that came out the gate, I think it started about 2014, 15, was passenger service, simple vehicles, single vehicles. And that was the first rulemaking. Then just in December 2019, we had the light duty motor vehicles, those vehicles 10,000 pounds or lighter, that just came out. Heavy duty trucking has yet to start. So in California, we can only do testing up to L2. And that is the highest we can go for heavy duty trucking. So I mentioned the segmentation because going back to the original, this law was passed in 2012. We're now at 2020, and there's still some aspects that are not completed. And then I'll throw a little bit of a difference. In 2018, actually, the California Public Utilities Commission, who regulates transportation passenger service, think shuttles, buses, that kind of stuff, decided to weigh in and say, look, we're also going to regulate autonomous vehicles. So they regulate autonomous vehicle passenger service and began another rulemaking under their purview. And they segmented into two different things under a pilot of driver and driverless for passenger service. And within that realm, we also had basically a prohibition that we cannot charge for fares. So taking the full picture is from 2012 to now 2020, we've moved along at a probably slower pace than everyone would have imagined. And for business purposes, it's made things a little bit complicated because we are not still seeing that regulatory certainty of when can we start charging, say on the passenger side alone, when can we start charging, right? And why that's important to note is because I think when you're trying to run a pilot and to see how riders are going to react to it, a key piece of that is being able to charge. And what is that charge? What does that cost to get in a vehicle, and how would that work? Having this, my fingers did more of the talking than I did. That having that key piece of information is necessary to continue advancing. And to this day, under the Public Utilities Commission, we do not know when that will come out, the proposed decision. We're actually waiting for one. They could come out any month or so now, and to see if we get the path to be able to do fare collection, right? So that is something I mentioned in terms of, as Washington thinks of what's important to Washington, make sure obviously it's the principles that are important to Washington first, and how you decide to regulate and do the rulemakings after this legislation, but also what are the goals you're trying to achieve, and how, for most companies, I can't speak for all companies, but I can speak for ours, is a path for regulatory certainty is probably what we most desire, because in order to test somewhere, we really want, and to make that investment of setting operations up, getting the fleets, you name it, mapping, the whole thing, it's a lot of money. But if you don't know where you're going to go in a couple of years or how far you can get to, it makes it really hard to plan and to budget for that. So that's just California experience. Jumping over across to the other side of the country, we have Pennsylvania. The difference there in Pennsylvania is that we have one agency that regulates us, which is PennDOT. There's some other agencies we work with licensing like DMV and stuff, but really PennDOT is the sole like AV. And there is no segmentation in terms of different types of classes of vehicles. It's just one type, but there is one blocker or one limit that we can't get to, and we can't do driverless testing in Pennsylvania yet. So while in California, it's segmented into different classes of vehicles. In Pennsylvania, the one thing is that even though we don't have two agencies that we have to kind of work with under regulation, we just can't do driverless testing there yet. And lastly, I'll mention Texas because we just launched here a couple months ago, so we're still new. And Texas for us, it was really because our focus has been, and we've announced it in the last couple months, trucking, right? And as I mentioned in the presentation, that in California, we can only do up to L2. So for us and our trucking exploration, being able to test more, that's why we went to Texas. So with Texas, we have one agency, TxDOT, some others that are necessary to do the work, but really it's been a good partner to at least get the ball rolling to begin the operations. And we do have that certainty of what we know, and because it was made by statute as well. So other states, have done it differently. Some states have, like Arizona, and has done that with executive order. And I think they may be going through a process to think about making that a little bit more statute-wise in the future. But at any point, I think the main takeaway I hope that I accomplished here, and hopefully I didn't leave everybody with more questions than answers, is just because you regulate it doesn't necessarily mean that we will come and test there. There's a couple other factors. The other one being markets, right? So a thing that I mentioned with Texas is not just because the rules are favorable and easier to work with, but the market for trucking is very great to work in the sense that you have the port over there out of Houston that allows you to a lot of goods moving up and down there, and then several cities from Dallas to San Antonio to Houston where there's a lot of goods movement. And for trucking to be able to test and to move goods, those different roadways and the volume that comes from that is what makes us very valuable for us to test there. Now, Washington, is not going to be left behind because of the port of Washington. Over there at Port of Seattle and Tacoma. So I think you guys have that going in terms of something that's attractive. And then California, like I said, we have several ports in California and goods, especially with Port of Long Beach, Los Angeles combo, and then you have Port of Oakland. So, but we can't go more than L2. So that's why we're not doing trucking. We will do some kind of level of testing, but not to the abilities of what you're seeing happen in Texas or in Arizona or, in other places. So, I think I'll leave you with that and be open to taking any questions and do my best to answer them.
Okay, thank you so much for that presentation. Questions or comments for Mr. Diaz?
Yeah, hey, Jim, this is Representative Binky. I got one for, so the question, I guess, kind of spurred from what you're talking about Houston. I used to live down there when I was stationed in the Army. The goods and services moving from Portland, Seattle to Vancouver, and that's similar to that same kind of dynamic. And are you looking at in the future of having that same I-5 corridor to be in that same context as Washington is with Texas? Or is that a possibility?
Thank you for that question, Representative. That is a good one, I think, in terms of comparisons, in terms of goods and movement. That is, our teams that I can speak a little bit for, like our business development team, they're always looking at what our potential partners are and what their interests are. So typically the way we do our testing, any routes that we have are one for a learning, right? In order to continue the road driver learning its routes. But also these are specific routes that we believe some partners that we are, have or are looking to have and are working with to get to a partnership are interested in seeing. So in working with some other potential partners, we've had designated certain routes in Texas in those corridors that you mentioned that are interested for them, and they like to see kind of how that looks like. So that's one of the things that you take into account is because for us, since we are we have partnerships, but we're not owned by an automotive company or et cetera, we want to make sure that we're working closely with our other partners to see where we're testing. So we could see that area as a possibility in the future, depending on who our partners are. If they say, we have something in this part of the country we want you to take a look at, and that would be the conversations to then make a business decision to start testing in that part of your part of the U.S. and the state. So I hope I answered your question.
You did. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for asking.
Other questions or comments? So we do have a question that showed up in the box from Scott Kuznicki. I'm sorry if I made a mess of your name. Good afternoon. What barriers do you see with regard to effectively deploying testing in Washington State? How can this group in Washington State's administrative agencies remove barriers and allow you to achieve the benefits of autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicle operations sooner here in a state with unique weather and infrastructure challenges?
All right. Thank you for that question. I think you kind of hit on the head a little bit. Another reason why you're seeing more activity in certain states, the sunnier states, I would say, is because of the weather. So, one of the reasons that a lot of testing is being done by companies in Arizona, for example, is because their, sun is probably 365 days of the year, and with certain times of the year that have certain climate changes related to rain and these days other stuff happening. But it makes it desirable to test there in addition to the routes I mentioned. So I think for Washington, one, you've already put the legislation.
Where is my mask?
Oh, I hope she found her mask. One of the areas that is interesting in Washington, I would say, is that corridor related to the port and the goods movement, right? And that's just on the trucking side, but also you have passenger service and shuttles, which I think somebody else after me will be talking a little bit about. So I think there's the elements. You guys passed the legislation this past session, so that's helpful to get the ball rolling in that direction and have people start looking. Weather is a challenge. I think we recognize the different elements, and that's part of the reason why our vehicles, we use 3 different sensors, right? We use cameras, we use LiDAR and radars, and it's the redundancy of those 3 that allow us to kind of have the best perception of what is out on the road to be able to get through some of the different climate issues that come up. So I would say weather, it's something of not necessarily a barrier completely, but it's something that's out there with the amount of rain that I understand that, that part of that Washington and certain parts get. But I think for the most part, having something like this, like an AV working group, I would say is a welcome, not only because it allows a venue for these kind of conversations to take place with different stakeholders, that are involved and interested in this, but also I think it keeps the industry, it keeps regulation, it keeps everybody accountable to say, hey, let's take a look at where we're moving. So this mechanism, the AV working group, allows the conversation to keep moving, whereas in other states, it may be very much focused on, the governor's office or the Department of Transportation, and, priorities change, right? This year alone, we definitely know what the priorities change with having to respond to COVID-19 and wildfire emergencies, especially here up in the Pacific Northwest, right, and along the West Coast. So things like autonomous vehicles, kind of get moving that along, kind of gets pushed to the back because people's lives are at stake with emergencies like this. So I think having an entity like this keeps everybody focused on this a little bit, and so it doesn't get lost when the next priority comes. So I think that's, just to put it out there, that's one of the favorable things I think that I'm seeing in spending time here with your group that's could keep the ball moving to where Washington wants to go towards.
Thank you, sir. We are limited on time, folks, so if you do have additional questions, please get them to staff and we will make sure they get them to the speaker so we can get them answered for you. I need to move on. First, I want to thank Mr. Diaz and Aurora for presenting to us today. We appreciate all the information that you provided today. Next, we have Sharad Agarwal. I hope I got it right.
No, it's good. Close. Agarwal.
Close. Do you go ahead and say it for me?
Sharad Agarwal.
Agarwal. Okay, thank you, sir. Who is Senior Vice President of Easy Mile. Sir, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just get it's up there. Sorry, got it. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to just appreciate the time to speak on this panel. I'm with Easy Mile. I'm going to talk just a bit about the company and a little bit about where the technology is today. And then I think the main topic I'd like to really discuss today is about, are cities ready for AV? I think the general question for us on the technology side is that even if our technology was ready today, would the cities be? or the states be? And I think that's a lot of your focus on this panel and this working group is to make sure that you're looking towards the future to prepare to make the most hospitable area for autonomous vehicles. So we are based in Colorado, our North American headquarters. We're a French-based all the technology is developed in France, but our North American headquarters is in Denver. My personally in background is all in transportation. I worked with First Transit for a number of years, including overseeing the King County call center for 3 years. I actually just moved from Seattle when I took this job 2 years ago. So I spent 4 years in Seattle living in Leschi. It was very, very much loved the city and loved everything about it. And so I have a good understanding of where the environment is when it comes to testing and technology there. So I'm very, so this kind of my background was to make sure we get some level setting on where we're coming from this. Easy Mile, just a quick slide on what we're doing. We're pretty global at this point. We're all over the world in Asia, Europe, and the US, with our biggest market really being the US today. We have 32 different vehicles all over the country. We've done 60 deployments across 14 different states. So we definitely have some feedback that we can provide across lots of different states, and I'll target a few later in the presentation. But we are growing as a business, and we're continuing to do that. We've, just like everybody else, have had a little bit of a setback with the last 6 months, but we still see a very good future in autonomy coming up. I wanted to give a few examples of some projects and building in some different examples of where we can start to test the technology and how it can evolve into different areas. Verizon is one of our partners in New Jersey. This is a completely private campus. They own all of the route that you see here, which is a hotel to their campus. So this is a very good early stage level of technology where we can really demonstrate autonomy in a closed environment. So different corporate campuses or large manufacturing areas are a good place to start when it comes to testing AV technology, where you can control the entire environment. And this is one example that we've done with Verizon. Another example of how to test the technology to prepare the state was what we did with Utah. They spent about a year and a half. They picked 9 different sites all over, primarily in the Salt Lake City region, but different use cases: universities, shopping centers, the Capitol, all kinds of different areas to really say, okay, how does this technology apply in these different environments, and which one could be the most likely use case for us in the most recent, in the soonest time frame. So it was a nice project to be able to just see in a lot of different use cases. We had thousands and thousands of riders. We actually did the last one we did there, our safety operator was dressed up as a student, so they didn't know he was on. So students actually were riding the shuttle like it was completely driverless, and we had really good feedback on that. And then also, I think the next evolution is what we actually didn't, we were doing in Columbus, but then due to COVID, we shifted the project. We were actually doing a full last mile of transit, really a transit service. It was a 2.7 mile loop, and transporting people in the Linden community to and from the transit hub and to the community center. And so this was an actual service that was developed for the community to be used in a gap where they had a transit gap. Unfortunately, it only lasted about 2 months before COVID hit, and now we've actually pivoted and using it for package transportation. So we're actually taking the food from the community center to the community instead of vice versa. And so this will go on until April. That wasn't the plan for the project, but it's just an example of the utilization that, in reality, the technology is the same for passenger, and it can be used in the same way for passenger and materials in that space. So now I want to talk just really quickly about the different technologies that are out there. I think it was a great lead in from Caesar, because we have two very different types of technology, and I just wanted to kind of highlight those right here. So on the one hand, you see the AV technology that's really focused on using existing vehicle types, putting their technology on. Caesar mentioned the Chrysler Pacifica. So like having a technology company with a existing vehicle type. Generally, they're a bit smaller. They're less than 5 passengers. They're usually the typical cars and vans. They're all approved for city roads. There's no restrictions on the FMVSS piece, so you don't have any kind of federal requirements that are blocking loading. They're not necessarily designed for high density travel like buses are, so it's a little bit different market compared to what we're looking at. And you have a lot of the big OEMs and technology companies. You have a lot of investment behind this space. Very publicly, there's a lot of companies like Aurora that are out there that are putting a lot of investment into this space. And typically the business model is, you'd already mentioned it, but really focusing on mobility services, which is the long term. So where we come in as an AV shuttle provider is that we're building a custom vehicle. So these aren't vehicles that are on the major production lines. They're really custom built for AV. The shuttles are 6 to 15 passengers. In the US, they do require special approval to get onto the public roads from the federal government. And that's been positive, mostly negative, I guess I'd say. But we've gotten to the point where we'd say it's more positive than negative. In the beginning, it was quite challenging. They are designed for these high density areas like buses and campuses and airports, but the speeds are much lower. I mean, at best, you're going to be hitting 15 miles an hour, maybe up. We think our target internally is 18. Just because when you're in this type of standing environment, you're talking about a custom-made shuttle. It doesn't have the same level of redundancy and safety features as like a Chrysler Pacifica would. So we kind of limit the speed in that environment. And you have mostly new startups in this space. There's starting to be some more European OEMs, but really this is a startup-driven area like ours. So that's kind of setting the stone on what the two different types of technology is, and I'll focus really more on what the shuttle side of the business could look like. So just some feedback now, going through on how do we get ready for AVs? I mean, we know that the technology is coming. That's a given. It's not even a question. It's just a matter of when. And so if a city wants to attract a lot of attention with the AVs, I mean, there's a lot more things that go into it than just allowing them to be there. And so I want to dig into a few of those topics right now. First, one of the things that the technology, I would say that if we are ready, the technology is from our perspective, there's a few things that are still missing to get the technology ready to be there. One is these shuttles are not able to be driven manually, which is a real challenge right now, just trying to reposition vehicles. So it's one part of the technology that needs to be improved. The speed is a bit low. I think even at 15 miles an hour, I think we need to get closer to 20 to get to what be a full public transit option. If you think about the buses going down Seattle, they don't really go that fast with all the stops. So 20 miles an hour would actually probably cover most of the public transit and airports and those types of environments. And a few other things about being able to detect passengers. If there's no driver, how does the bus know to stop? And being able to drive remotely in certain situations. So on the shuttle side, we have to really look at the FMVSS does provide some, it is kind of prohibitive right now to make long-term large deployments in these shuttles because they're not compliant with federal standards. There's also a balance of cost and technology. I mentioned speed. That's kind of one of the areas that if we could put a lot more sensors on the vehicle, but it would be a lot more expensive. And then there wouldn't be really any benefit to AV on the cost side. So you really have to balance how much the vehicle is going to cost versus how much savings you'll get with the safety and other costs. And then I think the other piece that we're still a bit not far, but we're not quite there yet on the shuttles is that typically a bus or a larger vehicle lasts a number of years, anywhere from 8 to 15. So if you buy a shuttle that's a 2 or 3 year shuttle, the numbers don't work. So from a technology perspective, I think we're not quite there yet either, in addition to where the cities are going. So I think in parallel, both the technology and the cities will move to get there. So thus far, on all the projects that we've done, all the 50 different projects that we've had over the country, I think what we've learned thus far is how passengers react, which has been quite positive. We've learned the maturity of the technology is on its way. It's not quite there, but it's on its way. We've learned how to manage battery and charging, which is a big piece of it. We've learned how to connect into infrastructure with traffic lights and soon to be smart intersections. So I think that's a big learning that's helpful. We've determined what the limits are of the technology, and you've already asked the question about weather. That's definitely one of the limitations, but also there's a speed and cost area. We know that there can be ridership options even with the demonstrations, and a couple other things is that some of our partners have used the demonstrations as ways to become innovators, and that's been sort of what's been driving us to this point are these areas of what's really supported projects. Now, when I think about if we were to say tomorrow, we want to put AVs on our road, there's a lot of questions that have to be thought through on how to prepare the city for that. I put a number of them here, and I'm only going to dive into 2 of them, but just a few examples are the stakeholder engagement. We've had a number of projects where there's 20 to 25 stakeholders for a single 1 mile route for 12 months. So if you can imagine putting an entire fleet of AVs in your city and how many different stakeholders are going to be affected by it, that's a big piece that has to be prepared well in advance to make sure that there's no delay when it comes to deploying the vehicles. Cybersecurity is another one. How are people looking at cybersecurity? That's another one that we come across. Another one is about job transition plan. I think that's a topic that has not been, that we don't want to address, I guess, at this point. But I know the newest legislation has some in the federal transportation bill started to at least put that topic on the table. But that needs to be addressed at some point. That is part of your transition plan, is what's going to happen and how are the jobs going to change over the next several years. And then the data, you've seen this kind of publicly on like who owns the actual data that's coming out of these services. If the city is providing the permit, if it's a technology company, is it the rider? There's all kinds of different areas. And I think those are things that need to be figured out before you start putting mass fleets of vehicles on the ground. And then a couple of other ones is that really like, how do you know which AV company is different than, or how do you know which AV company to allow on your city roads? Like, do you have a testing program? Do you have a standard? There's not really any specific ISO standards or regulations. Some other countries like Singapore and Germany have built actual standards about how do you deploy AVs, but we don't have that in the US at this point. It's a lot of self-certification, and every state is a little bit different looking at that. So, and I want to dig into two in a bit more detail with the questions. And one is about the liability in an accident. That's a huge question mark right now on when that comes to the table. And then also what some state and local laws are doing and using some examples from what we've done thus far. So just the first question is about, do regulations apply, when you're thinking about regulations, are they going to apply to public and private roads? So that's an interesting question, because as I mentioned earlier, some of the technology for corporate campuses like a Boeing or a Microsoft, or some of these large places where we could put the AV technology much sooner. Are you going to apply the rules to those locations? In some cases in Colorado here, that does not apply. Same in California, we haven't had that. But in North Carolina, when we were on a university campus on a kind of a private area, they applied the same rules from the DMV. So it's just a question mark based on the state on how they want to apply the specific regulations. And then the question always becomes also is what's a private road and what's not, and that's a whole other discussion for every state to have and what their definition is. Next question about is who's going to actually regulate the autonomous vehicles. It's a whole bunch of different groups in different states. As like Washington has, then Colorado had a task force, which was made up of a number of different groups that was set up from Governor Hickenlooper a couple of years ago. And it's done a very good job of just reviewing case by case. And so everything is on the table, just has to be reviewed. California, Caesar already went through primarily on the different groups that are doing the DMV and the PUC are engaged. And then North Carolina created through the DOT and the DMV were the two groups that were focused on regulation. Test criteria, I mentioned that as a potential really an area that should be looked at. California has a full process and application. I guess it's not necessarily testing as much as it is an application process. Colorado does not, and North Carolina did not. And so these were just areas that we were able to talk to the key players and become comfortable together on the project. And then even going further, do you put a plate on the vehicle? So that's another question mark on who owns it and where it goes, and public and private. So just some questions that I kind of wanted to propose as you're thinking about how to put AVs onto the road. These are the ones that we've come across a lot and how we've addressed them thus far. And then finally, talking about risk and insurance. This is a huge question mark, and there's a lot of unknowns that need to be figured out today. One is just the amount. I mean, what's the amount of insurance that we should be putting on to these projects? Is it higher, lower? Is it less risky or more risky? Those are things that have to be discussed. And should it be different for different speed vehicles? So like our Easy Mile shuttle that's traveling at 12 miles an hour, should that be the same insurance and risk for someone traveling 40 miles an hour? Private or public roads? Same kind of questions, like we have to think about where's the line that you draw when it comes to regulation. And that's part of the discussions that have to be part of the next few months or next few years. I think use maybe more of a lighthearted or a light option if something happens with the vehicle. It's an interesting question with the technology. If there is an accident, how do you determine who's at fault? There's all kinds of different components to the vehicle. There's mechanical, there's autonomous, there's LiDAR sensors, there's the operator if that's still on board. There's the infrastructure from a traffic light. What if that failed and then the vehicle hit the lamppost because the traffic light didn't properly? Or if the local government gave them the permit, are they the ones that are at fault? So I think there's just a lot of questions that have to be developed and thought through before the vehicles are going to hit the road from that perspective. And then just what other risk that the government could be taking once they approve the AV. So it's not to have just those kind of points on an accident, but are there other risks that the state then is absorbing by having the vehicles on the road? So I appreciate the time. I'd love to take some questions. As I mentioned, like we kind of really shifting our focus now. We're starting, or we're kind of scoping out a project right now in Colorado to bring in a number of vehicles in one location to start answering these questions, working with the local jurisdictions and looking to say, hey, we know that the technology will be ready in 2 to 3 years, but let's make sure that the cities are preparing for all the different areas to make sure that there's no more delay after that when commercial public transit, we're really focusing on commercial public transit once that's available.
Thank you, Sherrod. We have 2 questions in the chat box. The first one is from Justin Layton. It says, what is the cost per mile and or service hour ridership per service mile on your Ohio pilot?
Well, it's a little bit, I would say it's not a very good representative number, because in Ohio, the ridership was very low because we'd only gotten about 2 months into the project. The overall project for the year was about $1 million of allocation for 2 vehicles, 7 days a week, 14 hours a day. So the cost per hour, I think, was something around 60 in something in that range. But the cost per passenger would have been very, very high because the ridership was pretty low when we got started.
Okay.
I guess, Mr. Chairman, if I may
Yes,
do
by
a
all
follow-up.
means, Justin.
Mm-hmm.
Do you, so I guess, the Ohio thing might be a little harder, but maybe taking a more 10,000 foot level of other projects you're doing, do you have a better estimate if you looked at all your projects?
Well, I think
what that would be?
I think it's probably not as, for today's technology and today's vehicle, it's really more of a demonstration. So where we just announced last week that we're going to be building our first autonomous vehicle on a Ford E450 chassis with StarCraft. So a standard paratransit shuttle bus that you have at King County. And so just to give you some figures that will help with that scenario is that today an electric shuttle bus costs around $240,000, depreciated over 8 years. So that's the baseline on an electric vehicle. So we're targeting the autonomous price to be $375. So a delta of 120 over 8 years. So you're really adding another 20K roughly, not even, per year on the vehicle. So the cost savings that you can realize is going to be focused on that 20,000 per year number in the long run. So passenger counts or safety related, wages, overhead, whatever. That's the target that we should be looking at for autonomy, is the comparison to what the vehicle costs today, operating costs today versus what the autonomous operating costs will be.
But wouldn't the target, if I may, Mr. Chairman, wouldn't a target be for, if you're trying to operate like a transit service, wouldn't the target be the average cost of providing that service without being autonomous? Does that make sense?
Yeah, if you can put them applicable, I think that's right. There's a number of different components that will change with an autonomous service versus a manned service today. But ultimately, that's kind of what I meant. Like if you take the capital cost, or you can call it the operating cost. If the operating cost, what we're expecting is that the reduction in operating costs will offset the additional capital cost. Maybe that's the easy way to put it. So you will see a reduction in overhead.
You mean the human cost, the cost of not paying the operator, because that's really where the cost of operations comes from.
There's a safety cost, there's a overhead cost, there's mechanical costs. There are others, but yes, primarily will come from job transition.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen. The next question is from Representative Matt Bohenke. It says, what is the negative? What is holding you up from the federal position?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I was going to add, he mentioned something in the discussion about that negative. And that's why I put it in quotes of something that sounded like you were running up against a wall with the federal government and kind of pushing that through. So from a state level, we've been kind of, Representative Clove and I discussing, what is that barrier? What is holding you back? And maybe that's something similar to our state that we can work ahead now to reduce that barrier, allow that, opportunity. And then, so give you a little bit more context there.
Yeah, no, it's appreciate the question. So with the vehicles that are not FMVSS compliant, they require special permission from NHTSA. And it's more than permission, it's really a review of the route, review of the technology, and then every 6 months, a renewal of your permissions. And so what we ran into in the beginning was actually quite easy. They had one person kind of dedicated to that, and he was very pro AV and made it very simple. I think with changing administration, removal of people in different positions, it became constantly a changing, revolving door on policy. And so they started blocking things for months at a time. So we'd have 6 to 8 months go by where they wouldn't allow for any permissions. So we'd have states waiting with vehicles on the ground, couldn't do anything because the federal government wasn't making any decisions. They created a task force and a committee over the last year, which has gotten a lot better. And I think Elaine Chao has become much more proactive in having an AV test initiative. So the last, I would say, several months, there's become a lot more support from the federal level for non-compliant FMVSS vehicles. So that's really the holdback. Once you're compliant on FMVSS, and then there's no permissions required from the federal level, then it becomes to the state to make the decisions. So, and I don't think that's going to change from the FMVSS side until they actually change the standards through Congress over the next 5 or 10 years. So I think we're pretty much stuck with that regulation for the next several years. And we've had states, definitely, we've had senators, like I know in Texas, they would make phone calls and make things move when they could. But that's just it's still kind of it's not a very sophisticated process to do that. There's no long-term strategy with being able to do that.
Well, I could say, at least in the state of Washington, we're trying to make it more sophisticated and leaning forward in the foxhole. With Representative Clovis' help, we're kind of moving that forward and trying to stay, on the front edge of this to make sure we can, drive that leadership team across the nation. So appreciate that.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. I mean, states definitely have the opportunity to do that, and it's just a matter of getting ahead of NHTSA if you're looking for large-scale deployments to do that.
Other questions or comments for Sherrod? I don't see anything else in the chat box. I think you're off the hook, Sherrod.
Okay, thanks, Jim. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, sir.
See.
Okay, and please thank Easy Mile. We appreciate you taking your time to come and speak with us today.
No, it's my pleasure.
Okay, next on the agenda is Ariel Wolf. Ariel is the counsel for the Self-Driving Coalition for Safer Streets. Ariel, you have the floor. Ariel, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay, and I got my screen shared there. All set?
We're seeing a black screen right now.
All right, hang tight. Let me get this all squared away here. Says I'm screen sharing.
Jim,
Let me.
I'm seeing it on my end, Jim.
You are, okay. I'm not seeing it on my end for some reason, but go ahead, continue, please.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to share the actual. Perhaps is that better?
Yeah, I got you as well. Just like
That's
better.
better.
Great.
I can see it.
Yep, we're good.
Okay, great. Perfect. So let me just set up here. Okay. Well, what's interesting is that I'll just pick up from that last conversation. Just a little bit of background on my end. I was in Secretary Chao's office from 2018 to 2019 and working on these issues, including the exemption petitions. And I won't take too much issue with Sherrod's characterization. It was a tough nut to crack, no question about it. Really, the first couple of petitions for exemptions to NHTSA for AV-related, AV-related exemptions, and setting that up and figuring out how to move forward was difficult. And I think it was a fair characterization that a little bit ad hoc, and ultimately there are consequences to NHTSA and DOT signing off on these exemptions. They have to sort of ensure that they have an equivalent level of safety as a vehicle that would have the federal motor vehicle safety standards in place. So it was tricky, but I think it's fair that they've gotten better at the process going forward. So I figured I'd share that. Let me. I know being third in this panel, sensitive to presentation fatigue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and move quickly through the deck I have. I'm not going to cover everything, just so we have enough time, and I'm sensitive to the folks who are following me. So let me just, again, start at the outset, just say, so my name is Ariel Wolf. I'm an attorney at the law firm of Venable LLP in Washington, D.C. I serve as counsel to the Self-Driving Coalition for Safer Streets. And I want to talk a little bit about what that coalition and the issues that we're working on. So I'm going to start today by providing some background on the coalition, the work that we do. Let me move along here. And then talk about our approach to policymaking, and then a brief overview of the various state approaches, although I think we've covered a lot of that, so I may forego that in the end. Self-driving coalition is comprised of these companies: Ford, Argo, Lyft, Waymo, Nuro, Volvo, Uber, Aurora, and Cruise. So shout out to Caesar, that was a great presentation. And you'll notice that it's a combination of auto manufacturers, tech companies, ride shares. So what the coalition aims to do is really be the voice for the fully autonomous industry. It was founded in April of 2016. And it's focused on, as I said, enabling the development and deployment of fully autonomous vehicles, level 4 and level 5. And despite their different backgrounds, as I mentioned, the companies, they came together to form the coalition because of the commitment to bringing the tremendous potential safety and mobility benefits of self-driving cars to consumers in a safe and swift manner. And I know, I think it's the first time I've had the opportunity, honored to have the opportunity to present to this group, and there's been so much work that's been done to date. I do want to just level set, right, take a step back and remember that as we talk about all of the issues that need to be worked out with putting AVs on the road, just a reminder that there are so many benefits that we're working toward, that AVs have the potential to bring. And so that's really, so as we try and work those out, that's what we're trying to get to. I just got a note here. I want to make sure I progress through the slides here. Are the slides actually moving through?
No, they're not. We don't see the actual presentation. We just see an Excel document open, but not in presentation mode.
Yeah, so I think
Okay.
you got one screen sharing, but it's the wrong screen.
Okay, hang tight.
I do that when I teach. I got one screen I'm looking at, but the other one actually is flipping the slides.
So let me pull this up.
You know, I have 3 monitors across my desktop, so I know how that works.
Yeah, that's what I've got going on here. So give me 1 second. See if I can figure this out.
You may need to stop unsharing and then come back in.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do here. Okay. Share it again here. I won't share the screen. I'll share the, how's that?
Okay, we still have the, yep, if you click your from beginning slides, then it should present.
Okay. You see it?
No, we still see it as an Excel document that you're working in with the slides on the left and, the slide you're working on the right, but it's not in actual slideshow mode.
Yeah, it's not in presentation mode. It looks like it, hey, you have your.
Yeah, I click presentation. Oh, let me, let's see here. Presentation mode. Try this again. Well, it's hard for me to know what to tell you because I'm in the, click from beginning and all that. So
Well, we can see the slides. So if you just select them on the left-hand side, we'll see them.
how's that?
Yep, that will work.
I'll just do that. All right. I don't know what's going on here.
Awesome.
All right. Workaround. This is the new world we live in. Otherwise, I would have flown out and seen you all in person. Okay. So let's go back to where we were. So as I was saying, just quickly, I think it's so important to level set and talk about the benefits we're looking to achieve. The industry is looking to achieve to bring to consumers safety benefits. I think we have some fatigue from the stats that have been quoted in this area over time, and so I won't go through all of that. But again, it is important to mention. And let me pull this up. Again, focus on some of those benefits, a summary of what we're talking about. We've all heard the 90% statistic, or over 90% of motor vehicle crashes caused by human error. That's what we're focused on. And so as we look toward the possibility of bringing that down and substantially, it's important that we work through these issues and not, it's good to issue spot, but it's also important to try and get to yes, so to speak, so we can save lives and improve mobility. So very quickly, just go through some of the AV activity that the coalition members have been involved in. And I just want to talk, just mention a few of them. So Waymo, who's is on the call, their autonomous ride-hailing service, Waymo One, is providing thousands of Phoenix residents with rides to work, school, stores, visits to family and friends. Nuro has gotten a lot of attention recently on their zero-occupant vehicles for delivering prescriptions, groceries, and other supplies in Houston, a program that's operated since 2019. Lyft and its partner Aptiv are now Motional surpassed 100,000 self-driving ride shares in Las Vegas this year. And during the pandemic, Cruise's self-driving cars have been used to help deliver groceries and food to San Francisco residents in need. And other coalition members, of course, Aurora's spoken already, Argo, and the others. So getting to the crux of it, the coalition's approach to policymaking. You'll see here a summary of it, the priorities, expanding the testing and deployment of fully self-driving vehicles. And make a specific note here on the word deployment. Preserving the traditional state and federal roles, we've touched on that already some, and I mentioned in the comment earlier, just making sure we have clarity there, in particular, the federal role being in the design and performance and regulating the design and performance of vehicles, and having that preemptive effect, and having the states focus in their traditional areas, which are of critical importance. And then it was actually also mentioned, the previous presenter, on the liability side. In the spirit of having a dialogue, I would just say that the coalition's position is to maintain the existing liability regime. And this is where I would just say that there certainly are questions about, what happens if, in the AV context, what happens if there's a crash, if it's a sensor failure, if it's, and there are a number of hypotheticals put forward, but the reality is the existing liability regime is capable of handling that. And so proposals to come up with something new specific for AVs it's premature and unnecessary. There's new technology that's put on the road, every year, and our existing regime is capable of handling that through the whatever state law it's structured as, whether it's tort, negligence, or otherwise. Let's see. Our approach to state legislation. We'll walk through very quickly the model bill that we have. So with respect to state legislation, it's our view that if a state does choose to take legislative or regulatory action with respect to AVs, that action should allow for the testing and deployment of fully self-driving vehicles and zero-occupant AVs. Specifically, we believe that any state action should focus on removing impediments to the safe testing and deployment, and that would really create a pro-competitive environment and a level playing field for the emerging AV industry. So some of that's been discussed already, and what the impact of such a framework would have. More than a dozen states have taken this balanced approach to the testing and deployment in their jurisdictions. We'll talk about that. And those would include Georgia, Florida, Nevada, Michigan, Tennessee, Texas, and Arizona, of course, and others. So let me walk through the coalition's model legislation. At a big picture, so that we've created a model bill that would provide for the safe deployment of level 4 and level 5 AVs. The bill promotes safety while allowing for innovation to flourish by avoiding unnecessary restrictions on AV technology and by avoiding design mandates. In addition, the model bill would apply to a range of industries and AV business models, such as passenger-focused vehicles, commercial shuttles, TNCs, et cetera. And by doing so, this would avoid the need for the legislature to advance additional legislation in the future. So I think here, though, we, of course, would want to tweak that a little bit and just say that we were, of course, involved in following 2676 and the testing bill there. And certainly there, with respect to deployment, it may be the case that additional legislation is needed, and we can talk through some of those parameters. But I would say that we do believe it's important for states to avoid regulating the design or technology of AVs, since, as I've mentioned, the federal government is tasked with establishing that uniform national approach for vehicle design safety. And impose standards and impact of vehicle design and technology. So to the extent that states seek to impose additional standards, vehicle manufacturers may struggle to comply with dueling regimes across states. So we, through our bill, encourage states to draft AV legislation that focuses on issues related to definitions, safety, insurance, accident reporting, and registration and titling. So let's go through just some of that. Again, as I mentioned here. So as you'll see here, I think this should not be terribly earth-shattering in terms of the definitions that are mentioned here. This is the SAE J3016 definitions, but the reason why it's so important is having consistent definitions across the states, so that they're, again, with respect to the design and development of AVs, that there's a consistent framework along those lines, and there could be references to consistent definitions. So otherwise it becomes pretty difficult to even think about how the frameworks interconnect across state lines. I won't go through all of these. I think the concepts, I would imagine most of them are familiar to those of you on the call. So Section 2 of the model bill would authorize the operation of AV technology without a human driver. So the language is included here. You see, importantly here, there are 3 conditions that would allow for the operation of a fully autonomous vehicle on the public roads without a human driver. And that is, the conditions are that it can achieve a minimal risk condition, going back to those definitions. So one, that the vehicle would be able to achieve that condition, that the vehicles can comply with all the applicable traffic and motor vehicle safety laws of the state, unless the exemption, any exemption has been granted by the relevant agency. And then the self-certification model that is in place for, that we have for motor vehicles, that the vehicle has that certification label, that it complies with all applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards. And that becomes important on the federal side, that FMVSS make reference to certain human involvement, or at least on the testing side, or the presence of controls that require, or that involve human operation. That battle gets fought on the federal side, how to remove those so that there can be design changes. But for the time being, it may mean that these AVs have to have, even if they're not using the steering wheel, it has to have a steering wheel. But that's something that plays out in the federal side. Section 3 would address the issue of licensing and establish that the ADS, the automated driving system, is the licensed operator. And again, the language is provided here as just as a suggestion for how to accomplish that the ADS is considered to be licensed to operate the vehicle. It also plays a role in the disability side and the mobility expansion, so that states can take the approach that as long as an autonomous vehicle, a fully autonomous vehicle, can achieve those 3 safety conditions, and there's that safety assurance in combination with the federal standards, that there's no additional impediment to require a licensed driver that would preclude, say, someone with vision impairment or other disabilities that would otherwise prevent them from obtaining a license. Right, so this is a vision for fully driverless. So insurance, our approach would be just to peg the insurance model or the insurance application to whatever existing requirements exist under law. So whether that would be for personal vehicle ownership, transportation network companies, leasing, whatever the context is for the AV, just have the insurance apply there. We don't see a need to have additional insurance, but this is something that was addressed in the bill earlier this year with the $5 million level. But thinking about it going forward, is there a need actually to have a specified AV insurance level in the operational context? Duties following crashes, of course, critically important. The bill would address this by requiring the vehicle to remain on the scene and to report crashes consistent with existing law. There's a provision here that would authorize the operation of on-demand AV networks. That's as needed in a particular state or jurisdiction. So we have that as well. require the submission of proper registration and titling for AVs in accordance with state law, of course. And so again, you just need the cross-reference here for Washington. But it's something that it needs to happen with AVs, and we need to provide for it for the deployment. So this provision is important for state level preemption. And one of the things that, it just depends on whatever the term is, where you sit is where you stand. If you're thinking about the federal level, then in design and performance, then it's important to have strong preemption to allow for one national framework. If you're thinking about these issues that we were just talking about, it's important for a state to set that across the entire state, and to avoid situations where AV is going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction within the state and encountering different regulations, different reporting requirements. It just makes it almost unworkable. And then there's some language that would allow a human driver to operate a vehicle equipped with an ADS that's not fully autonomous, provided that, or in clarifying that human drivers can operate those fully autonomous vehicles as well. And that just gets at issues, sort of touch on level 3. Actually, we'll pause on this and let the next presenter think this through and talk it through. So it's not core to what we're looking at doing here, and I want to also be mindful of time. I think I may just skip this last piece if everyone's okay with that. We have some helpful maps. I know the slides were shared with the group. We have spoken about already the testing approach. I will so we've talked about Pennsylvania. I would just associate the comments of Aurora with respect to Pennsylvania, and there was a presentation that talked about Arizona. California's not mentioned here, but just yesterday, I believe it was yesterday, or maybe today, that time is tricky in COVID. Washington, D.C., the D.C. Council did, it was yesterday, did enact, or they passed, the D.C. City Council, an AV bill, and that was a testing approach. Worked with them for a long time on that. And then just thinking through, I would point to this last category here, the restrictive requirements. New York has the hands on the wheel requirement. Vermont has released some guidance, the Agency of Transportation there is what they call it, that really flows from the law itself, which requires a human to be present, as does Hawaii. And the requirement to have a licensed human in the vehicle for testing, even though they're not necessarily required to be involved in the operation, it does preclude the kind of testing that I know Waymo's involved in, and sort of that consumer acceptance piece for the absence of a safety driver. That's going to be critical to moving the industry forward. And so statutes and laws and regulations that require that, however well-intentioned, ultimately inhibit the full deployment of level 4 and level 5 vehicles. That is, let me just stop there and not belabor any points and see if there are any questions. Apologies for the technical difficulties up front. Thanks.
Oh, no, thank you, sir. We appreciate your presentation today. Before we get started on questions, real quick, a number of members have asked for a copy of your model bill. Can you email that to staff here so we can share that with the members?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. Sure.
Thank you. Questions for Ariel? Okay.
Just realized my video was off the entire time, so there you go. See, it's just a number of different. That's great. That's great. Well, here I am. I exist.
Questions or comments? Anyone? Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation. We want to thank the Self-Driving Coalition for Safer Streets and you for your time today. And we may have opportunity for questions later, so we'd ask you to remain online if you can.
I can certainly stick around for a little bit of time. I may have to jump because on the East Coast here. With respect to the representatives and all the distinguished guests, my daughter has softball practice, and I must run that as the coach. So we're heading to the end of the school day. So I'll stick around for a few minutes, and then I may have to jump. But appreciate it. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. And then I'll just ask real quickly, is there any questions of our panelists for the 12 o'clock AV industry panel? Any questions for Cesar Diaz, Sharad Agarwal, or Ariel Wolf? Okay, we have one. Under the coalition model legislation, since the automated driving system is the driver, what entity is responsible if the vehicle causes an accident? This was from Mark Madison.
Is that just a general question? I guess probably that's the open question. I think according to Ariel's probably right that there's existing liability to address those types of questions. But that's the question that has to be answered, I guess, is who is at fault when an accident occurs on an autonomous vehicle?
I think states are wrestling with that all over. So
yeah.
And I don't know if there's an answer right now. So, but I appreciate the question, Mark. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on. We're just a little bit behind, but we will catch up. Next item is the future of mobility and AV policy, automaker perspective. And we have with us today Dr. Anne Marie Lewis, Senior Director for Technology, Innovation, and Harmonization at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. Dr. Lewis, you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Jim. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I'll go ahead and try to share my screen, and I hope I'm able to do it. Ariel, you kind of scared me, but I wouldn't be. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Well, first off, thank you. Thanks everyone for allowing me to present in your meeting today. I'm the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, or Auto Innovators for short. Our mission is to advance technology solutions that are cleaner, safer, and smarter. And for those of you that aren't as familiar with us, we were formed in January of this year as the result of a merger between the Alliance of Automobile Manufacturers and Global Automakers. So, excuse my cat in the way. So the merger brought together the companies that were part of each trade association previously, and then added a couple more over the course of this year. So now we are totaling 37 companies, and here they are listed. As you can see, we represent all of the major vehicle manufacturers, a number of tier 1 and 2 suppliers, and other value chain partners. And looking at this list, you'll probably recognize that most of the companies we represent are developing automated driving systems. So, and I should add, as our mission is to advance the deployment of cleaner, safer, and smarter transportation solutions, the deployment of automated vehicles is clearly a major contributor to how we plan to reach this goal, and something that I personally am very passionate about. By way of background, my PhD is in mechanical engineering, so I'm not a lawyer, but I'm definitely, I work on this subject because I think the technology has a lot of promise and a lot of hope for the future. So today, I don't have many slides, but I thought I would just jump in and provide an overview of our recommended approach to AV legislation. Like the coalition, we have a model bill that I don't think we've shared with you previously, so we'll be happy to provide that as well. I don't have it outlined as neatly on my slides as Ariel did, but I plan to touch on kind of the guiding principles that we use to draft the bill, and also go through kind of the most important components. I'll also touch on the ULC model briefly, since I understand that that's been a topic under discussion in this group, and try to address some of those liability questions that just came up. And then I'll conclude with some additional recommendations. So We arrived at our model bill, I will say it was a long journey. Started a few years ago at the Auto Alliance. So at that time we were representing 12 of the OEMs. It took the better part of a year to coalesce around a model. And you know, in parallel, Global Automakers was creating their model bill. So the beginning of this year, when we merged, we also had the effort to combine our models, and fortunately, it came together really easily. Our model bills were pretty closely aligned to begin with, so it wasn't too terribly difficult. You know, if I had to describe kind of the overarching principles that we always would try to come back to during this process, I'd say that the main driver for us was to be technology agnostic as possible. The SAE levels have been defined, but there are still a lot of variations within those levels being pursued by AV developers. And I think that's for a couple good reasons. You know, one is the technology is still evolving and we don't really know what the end state is going to look like. And secondly, you know, we think that there likely will be different options of the technology packages for different use cases and also different applications. So just to give you a flavor of what I mean, you know, different use cases can range from individual ownership versus rideshare versus delivery vehicles. And I know this was, and also the shared automated vehicle concept that these all were nicely highlighted in the previous presentations. We also envision applications that range from a level 3 system where a human, either in the vehicle or remote, is responsible for providing the dynamic driving task fallback. Or a level 4 dual use vehicle where either the human or the automated driving system can drive. And then to the other end, an ADS dedicated vehicle where the vehicle does not include conventional driver controls like steering wheel or brake pedal. So all that is to say is, the premise for our model is to try to be inclusive of all of these potential applications for the future. So, looking at my slides now, first and foremost, we believe that the SAE J3016 terminology should be adopted as closely as possible in any legislation or regulation on AVs. And I'll provide on the next couple slides some examples of how we've translated, that technical standard to legislative, a more appropriate definition that still preserves the intent of the SAE standard. And then AV operation. Really, I'm summarizing this in 4 main points here, but in a couple slides, I'll show you how we address this in the model bill. And this part, I actually have copy and pasted the text from the model bill because I think that's the most important aspect that I wanted to focus on with you all today. So first, just at a high level overall for all types of AVs, AVs operating on public roads should be designed to operate in compliance with the state's applicable traffic and motor vehicle safety laws and regulations. AVs should also be certified to be in compliance with applicable federal motor vehicle safety standards, except if an exemption has been granted. And I know this was addressed in the previous panel as well. If an AV is capable of operating without a human driver present in the vehicle must be capable of achieving a minimal risk condition if appropriate. So that's more the level 4 and 5 application. And if the AV is capable of operating with a conventional human driver as defined by SAE, such operation is lawful and the human driver must hold the appropriate license. So that's kind of the overview of how we address ADS operation. And like I said, I'll dig a little bit deeper into that in a couple slides. Next, a point on the liability, registration, and insurance. So obviously these are very important pieces. We think that they should be, the approach taken should be consistent with the existing Washington State approach. We've seen that 21 states actually that have passed AV legislation have addressed liability in a way that is consistent with their existing state requirements for conventional vehicles. So we think this is working well. I mean, there's some discussion that can be had about the coverage amount. I think 5 million is what we typically seen and what we're comfortable with. But alignment with the existing approach is really, what we think is necessary at this point. And I can get into that in a little bit more on the ULC slide as well. Next, we agree with the previous presentation that on-demand vehicle networks should be permitted to connect passengers or goods. By my count, earlier today, I think 9 states have explicitly authorized these. And this is important, especially as we're seeing contactless delivery options like Neuro's application and others gaining the spotlight and importance during the COVID pandemic. I would say that, from my work with more with the traditional OEMs as well, they're considering these use cases in the future, and I think you're seeing a lot of promise there. So having an approach that allows this is helpful. And then lastly, we recommend that any legislation would allow that would allow the ADS equipped vehicles would be governed exclusively by an identified state agency. So this is important, to clarify both for the industry, but also for all the other state policymakers who is kind of in charge, and also provide, this point is really important, provide a single clearinghouse for all the AV related communications that may be necessary once the AVs are deployed. So this is just, I think, easier for everybody involved to take this type of approach. So the next couple slides, I've copied and pasted the definitions that we include in our model bill that we've adopted from SAJ 3016. I think you all probably have seen some version of these. Many of these have been adopted in other state legislation. Particularly ADS, you see that quite a bit. ADS equipped vehicle is level 3 through 5, if you want to think about it with the levels. We, as I mentioned before, we prefer not to use the levels in legislation because of the variation that can kind of happen even within the levels. Conventional human driver is an SAE defined term. It's a person seated in the vehicle behind the driver controls. Driverless capable vehicle is one, that exact phrase does not appear in SAEJ 3016. We thought it was appropriate to create this term for legislative purposes. So this is a vehicle equipped with an ADS capable of performing the dynamic driving task and can achieve a minimal risk condition without a conventional human driver. So really, this is a level 4 and 5, or a level 3 with a remote operator. So something we needed a term that encompassed all of those use cases. And I think you'll see why in a second when I get to the ADS operations slide. Dynamic driving task, this definition is pretty standard in a lot of bills that you've seen and consistent with SAE. Same for minimal risk condition, on-demand driverless capable vehicle network. This is pretty standard. Same with ODD. And then remote operator, this comes from the very latest SAE J3016 draft. So this contemplates that there could be either a remote operator that is able to provide remote assistance to an ADS equipped vehicle in driverless operation, or it's a human who is not seated in a position to manually exercise in vehicle braking, acceleration, steering, and transmission, but is able to operate the vehicle in near real time. And I honestly haven't heard too much about, announcements about the latter part of that definition, too many announcements about that use case being in the market. But again, I think it's important to preserve all options going forward.
I have a quick question for Dr. Loa.
Yes, ma'am.
So on your, I think it was 2 slides ago, there was a yeah, that one, driverless capable vehicle. And so would you say, I'm trying to picture the different vehicles that I've seen either in testing programs or out on the road now. And so a Tesla, would you consider that to be fitting this definition of a driverless capable vehicle?
No, I would not. Tesla is a level 2 vehicle, so they are not an ADS. Our bill does not apply to Tesla because it is, Tesla so far as I know, is not an ADS equipped vehicle. I think it maxes out currently at level 2. At least the Tesla's on the road today.
Okay, and so could I dig a little deeper into that? What is it, what are the characteristics about it that make it so that that you think that it is not capable of performing all aspects of the dynamic driving task? Because when it is in its quote unquote autonomous mode, it would appear to be able to do all of those tasks. But of course, the human driver is supposed to be able to maintain or retake control in an instant. But of course, we've seen that that's not really the case all the time. So what would be help me understand the difference between those two distinctions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. This is a confusing subject for those that aren't like working on this every day. So level 2, what the Tesla currently has, level 2 is a defined term by SAE, and it's defined that the vehicle can provide automated lateral and longitudinal control. So that you see this most, the vehicle provides automatic cruise control, ACC, and lane keep assist. So when you have that system on, you can do those two things, but it, traditionally it can't necessarily cross the lane. It can keep you in the lane. And I would say level 1 and 2 are very different from level 3, 4, 5, because level 1 and 2, the driver is at all times supposed to be responsible for the vehicle's performance. And that is a disconnect that you don't, from the way that the Teslas are advertised, I think that's not clear. And that creates a lot of confusion, and I think it's kind of unfortunate that it's happened that way. So level, okay, yeah. Cool. Okay, I'll go on. Okay, so this is my last slide on our model bill, and then I'm just showing, I'm highlighting the way that we've addressed AV operation. So, instead of talking about the levels, we think it's more complete to discuss a driverless operation and operation with a conventional human driver, as that I think should cover the gamut. So the first bucket, the driverless operation, we have 3 main criteria. The vehicle should be capable of itself achieving the minimal risk condition if a malfunction occurs. So the human driver is not responsible for that. Second, the vehicle should be subject to all motor vehicle safety laws and regulations of the dynamic driving task. And third, the vehicle has been certified to be in compliance with FMVSS unless it has an exemption. So this would allow vehicles without steering wheels when we get to that point. In the second tranche here, the operation of AVs with a conventional human driver, we have 2 main requirements. One, that the operation on public roads, operation on the public roads of this vehicle that is capable of performing the entire dynamic driving task while a conventional human driver is present is lawful under the state's vehicle code and subject to any relevant provisions of the existing vehicle code, including a requirement that the driver be licensed. So this one may argue that maybe you don't need this provision, but it's extra surety that that this situation is lawful, and also that the driver be appropriately licensed. Secondly, the ADS, when engaged and within its operational design domain, should also be subject to any relevant traffic and motor vehicle safety laws and regulations.
I have another question, if I may.
By all means, ma'am. Sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. So Dr. Lewis, one of the concerns that I hear out there among our first responder community in particular is the ability for an autonomous vehicle to follow the regulation of pulling over for lights and sirens. And so is that something that you consider to be under this category of traffic and motor vehicle safety laws and regulations? Is that where that fits?
Yes, that would fit. You know, the vehicles, as challenging as it may sound, they're and the engineers are working on it now to be able to recognize, you know, through the sensing and maybe microphones that there's the emergency vehicle and that they need to comply with the state laws.
And then additionally, the other concern that I hear is within construction zones and the ability to, you know, we have, as a human driver, have an obligation to slow down, follow the marked speed limit, you know, that would be temporarily assigned, and, you know, some types of, you know, there's some behavior we're required to do. And so would that also be the type of thing that could be covered under that traffic and motor vehicle safety laws and regulations?
Yes. I mean, if there's, you know, state code that addresses, you know, how to operate during work zone and that you need to, you know, comply with the updated speed limit signs and all that, then that would be covered. And I know there's some work led by USDOT. It's called the Work Zone Data Exchange Program, and they are working with a group of AV developers to come up with a standard data set of you know, information that could be exchanged from perhaps the city to or state to the vehicle the AV developer, and in real time be able to, you know, provide that information to the vehicle so that they would have, in addition to, you know, the sensing inputs from the vehicle, they would have an additional layer of redundancy in the system about those you know, fluctuating or dynamic updates. Okay, I think now I'll move on to have a slide on the ULC model legislation. You know, basically, you know, going through some of the pretty major concerns we have with this approach. I mean, primarily, I'm sure as you all know, since I think you've taken a close look at it, it's primarily focused on creating new liability regime for automated vehicles. It doesn't really provide the depth of AV operational requirements that our model bill does, or perhaps the Coalition for Safer Streets model does. You know, for instance, it doesn't address FMVSS exemptions, which are obviously really important for a significant portion of driverless vehicle technology. And instead, it focuses on creating this new term, automated driving provider and associated autonomous vehicle, that provides, you know, this modification to the current liability framework. I think that the goal that the drafters maybe had envisioned was to provide clarity from the get-go on who would be responsible in a crash, but really, you know, I don't think it's ever going to be that simple. You know, what the bill does is add an extra layer of complexity, not only for the AV developer, but also the consumer and DMV during the registration process, because you need to, you know who your AV or who your ADP is, and provide that when you're registering the vehicle. And, you know, really any additional step or complexity for this new technology for everyday person to navigate makes it that much more difficult for these vehicles to enter the market. So, you know, we think that the existing state liability policies work really well right now. You know, if there's a crash, there'll be an investigation to determine who's at fault, and traditional state tort and product liability laws will come into effect. So, you know, they will get to the bottom of who's at fault, no matter what, just like they do today. for instance, if a crash is deemed to be due to a bug in the ADS code, the OEM or third-party modifier, if that's applicable, could be found at fault and penalized accordingly. And if it's considered a defect, at that point, the federal government would likely get involved. NHTSA has defect and recall authority, and they would likely perform an investigation and potentially issue a recall. So there are existing mechanisms that are currently being used for advanced vehicles, for any vehicle technology, and they work equally as well for the advanced ones. So I'll also add that no state has yet adopted the ULC model, but again, 21 states have passed laws that address liability for AVs and align this with existing requirements. For example, California has in their regulation that the entity must meet liability insurance requirements with an option to self-insure, and is required to submit in all documentation to the DMV or DOT. So I think we could look to examples that seem to be working well, and that's what we would recommend. Is any questions on that one before I go to my last slide? It's on a different topic.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I got one for Dr. Lewis.
Yes, sir, by all means.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Lewis, kind of along that same line, you mentioned a couple of verbs that kind of stuck out of, they would definitely follow the current state existing laws, whether it's in the insurance liability registration. You don't see, or at least I haven't seen it, maybe a hit on it earlier, but what about privacy, data laws? Because now we're talking about the connectivity, and then we've learned a lot today about the different collection of data, where it should be hosted, things like that. Have you guys kind of addressed that with model legislation, or love to get your comments on that as well?
Great question. We do not have privacy or data access explicitly spelled out in our model legislation, but it is, a topic we as an association spend a lot of time working on, especially as it pertains to AVs. I think that in some cases, well, data is a huge topic. I will say from a safety perspective with the data, there's been, in California as an example, there's been some states that have required that there be, a specific additional data recorder just for AV types of information. We would say that that type of requirement's not appropriate for a state bill, because it's about vehicle design, and the federal, we think that federal government should keep doing what it's doing with regulating the design and construction performance of vehicles, and states should govern the operation of the vehicles. And this is so we don't end up with the 50-state solution of different design requirements for vehicles. So, that's kind of one piece of data. I think I will say too that SAE has they updated their electronic data recorder standard to include new pieces of information for AVs. So to the extent that anyone's interested in that, we can share that document because I think that that's something that the AV developers help create that standard, and is a sign that that's likely what is going to be followed going forward.
Yeah, I would add, I'm getting more phone calls about diving into the electronic data, similar to, so I used to fly, I'm still a pilot. It's that black box that we have on the airlines and airplanes. And so now people are saying, well, where's that black box on autonomous vehicles? When you go into liability, where's that measure? How are we collecting that data? And then who owns that black box, or who's kind of in an accident? NTSB is allowed to go in and grab that, and then we can do investigations, or where we draw that line of some of those discussions. So no, I appreciate your comments.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And yeah, the EDR standard, there's currently a part regulation, and it defines 16 data elements that's recorded on the vehicle, and it pertains to AVs as well. And then there's the law that says that the owner of the vehicle owns that data. So some of it is clear, and then there's some in the gray area about the new data.
Appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We're running a little bit behind, Dr. Lewis. Do you have much more?
No.
Okay.
This is just my last slide that is kind of obvious, I suppose, but just you know, an additional recommendation we have in general is that harmonization of say policies is helpful whenever possible. You know, as the companies are trying to test or deploy in new states, you know, to the extent that states can have harmonized approach, it's very helpful. And also, I'm hearing more and more from companies that differences in traffic laws are posing challenging from an AV development perspective. As you can imagine, you know, the representative mentioned earlier, like move over laws in relation to emergency vehicles. I've looked into this, and states have a varied approach, and they seem similar to a human conventional driver, but to program in those nuances to the AV system for each state is a challenge. And it's one that they're addressing, but you know, I'll just throw that out there as you all are looking on ways to advance this field. So that's all I had. And thank you for your questions, and please feel free to follow up if you have any questions going forward as well.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. I would ask for questions now, but we are running late. So I do have one quick question that came in a little while ago for you, Dr. Lewis. It says, if ADS equipped vehicles are governed exclusively by an identified state agency, what are your thoughts on this agency building internal expertise versus preparing to contract with third parties to address capability and capacity gaps?
I'm not sure if that's really a place for me to say, since I'm not as familiar with your in-house capability and whatnot. I think I'll defer to others on that.
Okay, and then Representative Klova, there was a response to your question from Scott Kuzniski, and it says, one way to understand that is the Tesla's technology in use today is intended to be fully supervised partial automation. Similarly, ADAS systems in cars ranging from Kia to Mercedes-Benz also operate in the SAE Level 1 and Level 2 domains. SAE Level 1 and Level 2 and Level 3 vehicles require the human operator to be available to take control of the vehicle, and the intention of Level 1 and 2 operations is that the human driver will not remove their hands from the steering wheel. I hope that helps.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Lewis. We appreciate your presentation today. If we do have follow-up questions, we will get them to you so that you can get them back to our members. Next is Kevin Beastie, Deputy Director for Policy for the Arizona Department of Transportation. Kevin, did I say your last name right?
Yes, you did.
Welcome, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Ariel has me kind of rattled. Let's see. Present. Can you see my screen?
Oh.
Hello?
No, sir.
All right. Let's try this again. It's not allowing me to share my screen. Huh. Well,
Do you have a slide? You provided a slide deck beforehand,
yeah,
correct?
let me try this. I'm going to try a different approach here. While I'm doing this, I want to thank you all for having me here today. I find these discussions extremely helpful. I think these dialogues, particularly among states and different government entities, really do help us get to the point where we can bring these technologies to the forefront, and I think we could do it safely. Boy, it's not. Okay, let me try this. I think I got it. All right, there we go. How's that?
That works. We
All
can
right.
see your screen, sir.
Woo! All right. Very good. Okay. So, and it's always great to be part of any discussion that Secretary Millar is on. Washington is very lucky to have him leading this discussion and the DOT. He's very well known and respected across the country on these issues. So, again, my name is Kevin Beastie. I'm the Deputy Director at the Arizona Department of Transportation, and I've been working in this area since probably the 2010, 2011 time period. During that time, many of you that have been in transportation will remember there was a lot of discussion about autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles are coming, but there wasn't a whole lot of discussion about what that meant for government, what that meant for the public, and how the companies and the different interests could work together on this issue. So let's see. So I'm just going to give a brief background on Arizona's journey in the AV, about our AV journey. As mentioned earlier, around the 2012 time period, there was a move primarily in the western states to enact legislation to govern the testing of these types of technologies and to provide some sort of frameworks. It was no different here in Arizona. Back in 2012 and 2013, there was legislation introduced. I was with the department at that time, and we had a lot of discussion with members of our legislature, our governor, OEMs, the tech companies, and all the stakeholders on this. And what was determined was that it was really too soon to move on any type of legislation, that the department would work with stakeholders, would work with our public safety officials, and look at where Arizona is from a regulatory or governance structure and see what, if anything, would need to be done. And it's also important, I like to point out that when I tell the story here in Arizona, it's in no way to say that this is the way to do it, and this is the only way to do it, or to infer that other states are not doing enough. You know, we respect that every state and every local government has constituents, and they have a duly elected body that is in charge of reviewing these and making decisions, and that needs to be respected. So in Arizona, when we took some time and we went through our statutes, we really discovered that the regulatory structure and the governance structure in Arizona was really set to allow this type of activity. One of the, there was a lot of questions early on, like everybody has, a lot of what ifs. But really what it came down to is initially what we were looking at was having vehicles testing on public roadways in Arizona. And if you think about it, that's been done across the United States for decades, right? GM didn't come to a state and say, hey, listen, we've got this whiz-bang technology called the automatic transmission. We'd really like to test that on your roadways. So, we kind of looked at what we've already been doing and see how this can fit into it. So in 2012, 2013, again, lots of discussion, lots of debate. The bills did not move forward. Fast forward to 2015, new governor, Doug Ducey, had a real keen interest in looking at technology in Arizona. We have a lot of tech companies in Arizona. Maybe not as much as in the Seattle area, but Intel is a very big presence here in Arizona. Our universities were very interested in looking at this. So he signed his first executive order, which tried to put a framework around companies who are interested in coming here and doing some limited testing. So that the first executive order in 2015 kind of set that up. And the structure at the time was they were going to, the Department of Transportation, Department of Public Safety, Department of Insurance, the executive agencies that were in charge of a piece or any role in this development would be part of this group. And we would review and look at what Arizona needed to do to promote the safe testing and operation of these vehicles, a lot like what your committee is doing now. So again, what we determined was there were some statutes that needed to be changed, and I'll get to those real quick. For example, truck platooning in 2017, we had to, like many states, address the issue that in most, if not every state law, it talks about how closely you can follow behind another vehicle. So that had to be adjusted, and we did. In 2018, there were 2 additional executive orders, and I'm going to talk about them real quickly in the next slide. Again, as the technology was evolving, the use of executive orders and a governance and regulatory structure that was already naturally geared towards this type of technology, the executive orders were advanced to deal with these changes. And again, I'll touch on those quickly in the next slide. And then in 2018 and 2019, again, there were certain things that were in state law that made it difficult for certain devices to operate. So personal delivery devices, personal mobile carrying devices. These are little delivery devices. We worked very closely with our League of Cities and Towns because these were going to be operated obviously on city streets, not on state highways. So we went in and made adjustments for that. Let's see. Well, I'm going the wrong way. Hold on, please.
That's okay. It's after lunch.
Okay. So yeah, I thought I was hitting the right key. So the 2 executive orders, the 2 subsequent executive orders, again, the first one wanted to deal with, okay, so we're kind of past the testing phase. Now we're talking about what if a vehicle is able to operate without a operator in the vehicle? What are the next steps we should take? And one of the key elements of the first executive order in 2018 was the first of its kind law enforcement protocol. Director Ducey directed the Department of Public Safety to work with local law enforcement and first responders to develop a protocol that we could use with companies to address issues like, what if there's nobody in the vehicle and law enforcement needs to interact with it? What if in a parking lot somebody backs into a vehicle and that vehicle has nobody in it? How does the driver exchange information? So one of the benefits in Arizona is the Department of Motor Vehicles is within the Department of Transportation. So we're able to develop a system. So when a law enforcement officer wants to pull over a vehicle, they obviously, run the plate, and the information comes from through our agency on all that vehicle information. So we're developing the system where that would be the same thing with an autonomous vehicle. If the law enforcement officer pulls up that vehicle, all the contact information, insurance information, contact, who they need to talk to, will be available to that first responder. So I point out to people, if you go to our website and pull this up, there is a revision date on that policy or on that protocol, and that's because it's going to change, right? The more we learn, the more these technologies are out there, the more incidents that may or may not happen, we can make adjustments to it. So that's kind of a living, breathing document right now. And then there was another executive order which developed the Institute for Automated Mobility. And this is an organization that's made up of our Commerce Authority, local companies, our other government agencies, and our universities. And it's to help plan the future for these types of technologies in Arizona and how we can integrate that into our transportation system. All right, next slide. So where are we now? So in Arizona, we're basically testing everything from small delivery vehicles to commercial vehicles. Neuro was mentioned earlier. They started their food delivery service in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a partnership with Fry's. It was in our opinion, wildly successful. We heard from neighbors and the locals, the city officials, that it was something that was really a benefit to the community. We have Waymo who is also on the call, doing passenger shuttles, and have been for a number of years now, all the way up to commercial motor vehicles. One of the keys in Arizona that we found is keeping our local municipalities in the loop. They're actively involved. One of the first conversations I have with companies when they contact us and ask about operations here in Arizona is one of the first things I do is I ask, where do you want to test? And then if they have a locality, we immediately put them in touch with the local officials, first responders in that area. I can't stress enough, some of those discussions are critically important because a lot of these technologies are going to be on local roads as opposed to highways. And the more you could get buy-in from the locals, the better it is. I don't want to take up too much time, but maybe at a later date, I could tell you some of the success stories, particular in Chandler, Arizona with Waymo. Watching the partnership there as somebody who's been in government for, gosh, a few decades, it's amazing to see the collaboration that's going on between the chief of police, the fire chief, the tech folks at Waymo, down in Tucson, Too Simple. It's just really something that I can't stress enough. All right, so here's some of the companies that are currently here in Arizona. As I mentioned, Waymo, Too Simple, GM Cruise, Local Motors has a local headquarters here, and they're doing some passenger shuttles. And UDelv is doing some food delivery out in our West Valley. And these are all companies that are partnering with our local businesses, local governments, and first responders. Here's the list. And then finally, there's my contact information. If I could ever be of any kind of help in providing some lessons learned or best practices that we've experienced here in Arizona, we're constantly in conversations with our partners because this is going to evolve the technology. It's going to transform all our lives and how we do transportation. As I mentioned earlier, in the early years, back in 2010, 2011, there was a lot of anxiety in the transportation system about what do we have to do? Do we have to put in sensors? What do we have to do? You look at today where there is actual collaboration between these tech companies, auto manufacturers, and governments. It's really going to benefit us for the future. So I'll stop talking there. I think it's much better to have dialogue than a whole bunch of slides and one person talking. So again, thank you, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Kevin. We have one question from Brian Missley. Brian, did you want to ask it, or do you want me to ask it?
I'm happy to ask it. So the question is, what can we learn, Washington? My camera's off here. What can we learn from you guys in terms of how to harmonize cross-state regulations? I mean, obviously you're doing truck testing; those go across interstates, which cross borders and stuff. Any advice for us in terms of dealing with corridors that cross states and what you guys have found?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So we, along with California, Texas, New Mexico, I forget how far east we go, but we have collaborated with the DOTs in those states to come up with an I-10 coalition. And so basically, what corridors are you looking at and how you bring those folks together? And that's been very beneficial. And we've been looking at everything from cross-state operations of AVs to truck parking electronic permitting, all those things. So I would utilize those types of partnerships on, you know, and almost every region has those, right, on major interstates, and really, you know, put a focal point on that.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Other questions or comments for Kevin? I don't see any. I don't see any in the chat box either. So thank you, Kevin. We appreciate your presentation today.
Thank you.
So next we have a open forum for members. So if there's any items that members want to bring forward to discuss, the floor is open. So anyone? I'm not seeing anything. So I know no other business to come before this executive committee and would adjourn the meeting if there's no objection. Hearing, seeing no objection, so ordered. We are adjourned. Everyone have a great day today. Thank you.
Take care. Great to see you, Shelley.
Bye now.
Thanks, everybody. Good input.
Thanks.
Definitely.
Bye.
Yes.
Take care. Great job today.
Great meeting.